They had no idea who they were dealing with. When one flight attendant tried to force a black family out of first class, the conversation seemed like just another act of familiar prejudice. But just seconds later, the bombshell dropped. This family wasn't just rich, they owned the entire airline. What happened next changed everything. Before the story begins, comment below to let us know where you're watching from today. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to share and subscribe for more. On a sweltering summer day, the boarding gate at Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, buzzed like a broken beehive. Passengers jostled, breathlessly searching for their seats, their chatter mingling with the habitual sound of rolling suitcases. In that crowd, one family of 3 stood out: John Williams, his wife Sarah, and their 5-year-old son Ethan. John, in a finely tailored navy suit, carried a gleaming leather briefcase, walking with steady confidence. Sarah, elegant and radiant in a light cream dress, held tightly to Ethan's small hand. The little boy skipped beside his mother, his joyful laughter ringing out like a cheerful melody. They waited expectantly for this trip, a precious escape from the usual humdrum of daily life. As they entered first class, the cabin's warm lighting enveloped the plush interior, feeling like a welcoming embrace. John smiled silently, looking at the seat numbers. "We're here," he said gently to Sarah, leading her and Ethan to their seats. Fellow passengers around them nodded polite greetings, and the Williams family began to settle in. Sarah gently helped Ethan get settled, handing him a small toy airplane. Ethan's eyes lit up, his face beaming with happiness. Meanwhile, John carefully stowed their carry-on luggage in the overhead compartment. From across the cabin, a nameless flight attendant, Emily Johnson, watched quietly. Her sharp eyes scanned the family, her lips pressed into a tight line. Emily adjusted her uniform as if preparing for a confrontation. Then she walked briskly toward them, her shoes clicking rhythmically on the aircraft floor. The placid smile on her lips couldn't hide the judging look in her eyes. "Excuse me," Emily began, her voice holding a sharp edge of authority as she addressed John. "May I see your boarding passes?" John turned calmly, his hand already reaching into his jacket pocket. "Certainly," he replied with a polite nod, handing her the tickets. Sarah looked up, sensing a hint of unease in Emily's tone. But Ethan, innocent as any child, remained engrossed in playing with his toy airplane, oblivious to the tension gradually spreading in the air. Ethan, lost in his own world, happily launched his toy plane into the air, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Emily, the flight attendant, scrutinized the tickets with what seemed like excessive intensity, her brow furrowed as she rechecked every detail. "First class?" she questioned, her voice strained as if the idea stretched her belief. John nodded once, his composure unwavering. "Yes, these are our seats," he replied evenly, his tone firm yet laced with an underlying strength. Sarah, however, caught a fleeting glimpse of annoyance in his eyes. Emily hesitated, her agitation palpable. "I'm sorry, but I need to verify this with the front desk." "Please remain seated," she stated curtly, turning on her heel. Her pace quickened as she walked away, her movements tense. As Emily disappeared behind the curtain, John gently returned to his seat, his expression unreadable. "What's going on?" Sarah whispered, anxiety threading through her soft voice. John placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Probably just a routine check, don't worry," he said, though the slight clench of his jaw suggested otherwise. In the galley, Emily hunched over her phone, speaking to a ground crew member in a hurried, hushed tone. "I have a situation here," she said, stealing glances toward the cabin. "There's a family in first class and I'm not sure if their tickets are valid. Can you confirm their reservation?" The staff member sounded confused. "The Williams family? Their tickets were purchased weeks ago, fully confirmed. Is there a problem?" Emily paused, her frustration simmering beneath the surface. No problem," she muttered, abruptly ending the call. But instead of returning with an apology, her face hardened. She straightened up, took a deep breath, and strode back into the first-class cabin. As Emily approached their seats, her voice took on a sharper, more assertive edge. "I'm sorry, but I need you to step aside for a moment. It seems there's been an error with your reservation." Sarah's brow furrowed as she exchanged a worried glance with John. Ethan looked up from his toy, confused by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. John slowly rose to his feet, his calm demeanor a thin veil over the frustration simmering beneath. "What sort of error?" he asked, his voice even but probing. "I need to verify your seating," Emily replied, avoiding his gaze. She gestured toward the galley. "Please follow me." John hesitated, then nodded, signaling for Sarah to stay with Ethan. As he followed Emily, whispers rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged curious glances, sensing the unfolding drama. Sarah watched them disappear, her unease growing. Ethan tugged at her sleeve, his small voice cutting through her thoughts. "Mommy, what's wrong?" he asked. She forced a smile, squeezing his hand tighter. "Nothing, sweetie," she said gently. "Daddy's just sorting things out." But deep down she knew this was no simple mix-up. Something was amiss and it was about to escalate. In the galley, John stood tall, his presence unwavering as Emily stumbled through her explanation. "Sir," she began, her voice wavering between hesitation and forced authority, "we are just trying to clear up a seating matter. It appears there may be a flag on your reservation." John raised an eyebrow, his tone sharp yet restrained. "A flag? I booked these tickets weeks ago. Fully paid, confirmed. What's the issue?" Emily crossed her arms, a defensive posture creeping into her stance. "The issue isn't payment. This is a first-class cabin, and we have to ensure all seating is correct." John stared at her, absorbing the insinuation. His lip twitched, not in amusement but in disbelief. "A first-class cabin," he repeated. "Are you saying I don't belong here?" Emily stiffened, realizing her words had ventured into dangerous territory. "Of course not," she snapped, her curtness a flimsy shield for her discomfort. "I'm just following procedure." John took a deep breath, a flicker of anger breaching his composure. "Fine," he said, his voice firm. "Let's resolve this quickly. My family is waiting." Back in the cabin, passengers were whispering among themselves. Sarah felt their eyes on her but kept her gaze on Ethan, who was tinkering with his toy. A middle-aged man across the aisle leaned toward her, his voice low and kind. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Sarah attempted a smile. "Just a mix-up, I think," she replied, though her words sounded hollow even to her. He nodded, but his gaze toward the galley betrayed his skepticism. While John waited, Emily stepped aside to confer with another flight attendant, a younger woman named Grace. Grace frowned, listening intently before glancing at John. "Have you checked the reservation system?" she asked cautiously. Emily scowled. "Yes, but it's not just about the ticket. Look at him," she hissed, nodding toward John. "Does he fit the usual first-class profile?" Grace's eyes widened in shock. "You can't judge like that," she hissed back, her voice firm but hushed. "If his ticket is valid, that should be the end of it." Emily huffed, pushing past Grace to face John once more. "Sir," she said curtly, "I'm afraid I will need you and your family to move to the main cabin until things are sorted out." John tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "On what grounds?" he asked, his voice heavy with authority. "It's procedure," she replied stiffly, avoiding his piercing gaze. John's patience snapped, his tone becoming so calm that it chilled Emily to the bone. "If you're—" As they neared the first-class area, all eyes turned toward them. John's return ignited a fresh wave of murmurs. Passengers could feel the tension radiating in the air. Sarah stood up, her gaze locking with John's in a silent question. He offered a reassuring nod, but a subtle shift in his expression, a glint only she recognized, hinted that matters were far from resolved. Emily lingered, visibly flustered, as she escorted John to his seat, her mind racing behind a professional mask. Sarah looked at John with quiet, probing eyes, but he gave her hand a gentle squeeze, offering her a measure of calm. Ethan, sensing his father's return, beamed a bright smile and resumed launching his toy plane, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around them. Before John could even settle back into his seat, Emily turned around, her face set with a new resolve. "Here is a rewritten version of the passage you provided, crafted to be more engaging and emotionally resonant while preserving the original meaning. The character names have been Americanized, James to John, Celeste to Sarah, Liam to Ethan and Veronica to Emily, and the setting has been adapted to fit a modern American context on a commercial airline. The tension is heightened with vivid descriptions of expressions, body language and atmosphere, and the dialogue is sharpened to amplify the emotional stakes." Emily stood before them, her posture rigid with reluctant determination. "Sir," she said, her voice tight and laced with unease, "we've decided it would be best for you and your family to move to the main cabin until we can fully verify your reservation." Sarah's jaw tightened, a flicker of indignation crossing her face, though she remained composed, glancing at John to gauge his reaction. John took a slow, deliberate breath, his eyes locking with Emily's with an intensity that seemed to hold her in place. "Our tickets have been verified," he said, his tone calm but laced with unmistakable steel. "We paid in full for these seats. If there's a legitimate reason for us to move, I'd like to hear it now. Emily hesitated, her confidence wavering under John's unwavering gaze. Her hands twitched slightly at her sides, betraying her anxiety. The airplane cabin grew noticeably quieter as passengers began to take notice of the escalating tension, their hushed whispers rising like a brewing storm. An older woman a few rows back leaned toward her companion, her voice soft but pointed. They seem perfectly polite. What's the problem? Nearby, a younger man wearing a baseball cap spoke just loud enough to be heard. They're paying customers just like us. Why are they being singled out? This growing wave of dissent seemed to unsettle Emily even further. Her face flushed, her tone turning sharper as she struggled to regain control. Sir, I don't want to escalate this matter. Please cooperate, or I'll be forced to involve security. Sarah's eyes narrowed, her patience stretching as taut as a drawn bowstring. Before she could retort, John raised a hand, his gesture gentle but firm, signaling her to remain calm. He rose slowly, straightening his suit jacket with precise, measured movements that exuded quiet authority. If you're calling security, he said evenly, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade, make sure they bring an explanation. The challenge hung in the air, creating a ripple in the confined space of the first-class cabin. Emily's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground, though a hint of desperation crept into her voice. Please gather your belongings, she insisted, her eyes darting nervously toward the passengers watching with rapt attention. John stared at her for a long, silent moment, letting the weight of his gaze sink in before turning to Sarah. It's all right, he murmured, his composure unwavering. Let's go. The cabin fell silent as John, Sarah, and Ethan stood and began to gather their things. Ethan clutched his toy plane, his earlier excitement replaced by a look of bewilderment that clouded his young face. Sarah held her head high, her expression a mask of calm, though her grip on Ethan's hand tightened. John led them toward the main cabin, his steps measured, unfazed by the countless eyes following their every move. As they walked, he slipped a hand into his pocket, retrieved his smartphone and sent a quick text, his face giving nothing away. They were escorted to cramped seats in the middle of the main cabin, a stark demotion from the plush luxury of first class. John helped Sarah settle Ethan into his seat before taking his own beside them, his posture straight and composed despite the tight quarters. Sarah's hand rested lightly on Ethan's shoulder as he played with his toy, but her sharp gaze toward the first-class cabin hinted at the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. John, however, remained unperturbed. He pulled out his phone again, typed a short message and leaned back, observing the scene with a quiet intensity. Meanwhile, back in the galley, Emily's anxiety was spiraling. She overheard snippets of first-class passengers' whispers as she passed. That's not right, one man muttered, shaking his head. Another added, this will backfire. Her stomach churned but she pressed on. As she reached for the galley phone, it rang sharply, startling her. She picked it up with trembling hands, her voice wavering. This is Emily. The captain's voice crackled through, stern and uncompromising. Ms. Johnson, I just received a call from the airline's executive team. A passenger on this flight contacted them directly. I need to know what's going on, now. Emily's stomach dropped. It was just a routine matter, she stammered, her confidence crumbling. I thought there might have been a mix-up with their tickets. A long silence followed, and when the captain spoke again, his tone carried a warning. Handle this carefully. We can't afford this kind of mess. Tread lightly until I say otherwise. Emily hung up, her palms slick with sweat. She glanced toward the main cabin, where John sat with his family, his composed demeanor radiating a quiet power that made her skin prickle with apprehension. For the first time she felt the full weight of her choices pressing down on her, a growing realization that she might have misjudged the person she was dealing with. In the main cabin, John sat unbothered, as if the downgrade to a cramped seat didn't faze him in the slightest. Sarah, beside him, kept a protective hand on Ethan's shoulder as he played with his toy plane, though her occasional glares toward the first-class cabin betrayed her simmering anger. John pulled out his phone again, typed for a moment, then leaned back, his gaze calm and calculating. Back in the first-class cabin, the passengers' murmurs grew louder. A tall man in a tailored suit leaned toward Emily as she passed. That family has valid tickets, he said, his tone edged with disapproval. What's the problem? Emily tried to sound calm, though she was straining. It's just a matter of procedure. Everything is under control. The man frowned, unconvinced, but didn't press further. She hurried to the galley, where her colleague Grace was arranging a tray of drinks. Grace gave her a reproachful glance as she handed her the tray. "You need to fix this," she whispered. "That man is not an ordinary passenger. He's calm, but he's not letting this go." Emily bristled. "I was following protocol. It's not my fault people can't stand being questioned." Grace slammed the tray down harder than necessary, her patience wearing thin. "Protocol isn't meant to target people on." In the main cabin, John watched Emily emerge from the galley, her face pale and her steps faltering. She made her way toward their row, her usual confidence completely gone. "Mr. Williams," she began, her voice low and shaky, "I wanted to apologize for the inconvenience. It seems I made a mistake." John turned slowly to face her, his expression unreadable. "A mistake," he repeated, his voice even. "On what grounds exactly did you remove my family from first class?" Emily swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. I made an error in verifying your reservation. It won't happen again." Sarah's gaze bore into Emily, her composure cracking. "You humiliated us in front of everyone," she said, her voice sharp. "You assumed we didn't belong there. You think an apology makes up for that?" Ethan glanced from his mother to Emily, sensing her anger, and shifted uncomfortably. John placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's arm. "Sarah," he said gently, his voice calm, "not here." He turned back to Emily, his eyes hard. "I'll be taking this up with your superiors directly. Now we'll remain in our seats." Emily nodded stiffly, retreating toward the galley with quick, unsteady steps. The weight of her mistake was beginning to settle in, though she still didn't fully grasp its scope. John leaned back in his seat, a faint smile playing on his lips. He had made his move and the rest would unfold in due time. This version enhanced the emotional depth with vivid imagery, like Emily's twitching hands or John's steely gaze, and amplified the tension through sharper dialogue and passenger reactions. The modern setting was reinforced with details like John's smartphone, and the Americanized names and setting make it relatable to a contemporary U.S. audience while keeping the core plot intact. From humble beginnings, John Anderson had risen to the position he held today, a man of influence, intolerant of injustice no matter how small. Decades of hard work and quiet determination had led him to become a major shareholder in Sky-High Airlines, yet on this flight he was just another passenger, or so Vicky Summers, the flight attendant, had assumed. In the galley, Vicky paced relentlessly, her sneakers squeaking on the linoleum floor. Her nerves were stretched as taut as an old rope, each step a desperate attempt to outrun the panic clawing at her chest. She had made a terrible mistake, targeting the Andersons based on her own hasty judgment, and now the consequences were closing in. Grace, her colleague, approached cautiously, arms crossed and eyebrows furrowed. "So what's the plan now, Vicky?" Grace asked, her voice calm but laced with a hint of reproach. Vicky stopped mid-stride, her hands trembling as she turned to face Grace. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice so faint it was almost swallowed by the drone of the plane's engines. I never thought it would spiral like this." Grace's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing. "You should have thought about it before you treated them like they didn't belong. You judged them, Vicky, and now it's out of your hands." Vicky glared at her, her cheeks burning but remained silent. Grace's truth cut deeper than she could bear to admit, slicing through her defenses and leaving her raw. She turned away, gripping the galley counter, her knuckles white as she struggled to maintain her composure. The rest of the flight dragged on, a torturous stretch punctuated only by the hum of the engines, a sound that failed to mask the thick tension permeating the cabin. In first class, passengers cast furtive glances at John Anderson and his family. Some displayed a mixture of curiosity and respect, admiring the quiet dignity of a man wronged. Others feigned indifference, burying their noses in magazines, though their hushed whispers betrayed their fascination. "Did you hear? That's the owner of the airline," one woman whispered to her companion, her voice tinged with awe. "Yes," the man replied, shaking his head. "And she tried to kick them out of first class. What was she thinking?" As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, cutting through the murmurs. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are in the upright position. Flight attendants, prepare for landing." John adjusted his seat with a calm, deliberate motion, turning to Sarah. "It will all be over soon," he said gently, his voice a steady anchor in the storm. Sarah offered a small, supportive smile, her hand briefly touching his, a silent promise of solidarity. Beside them, their son Ethan swung his legs, clutching his toy plane, blissfully unaware of the weight of the moment. In the galley, Vicky stared at the clock, her chest tightening with each tick. The landing, usually a moment of relief, loomed like a guillotine. She knew what awaited her, the questions, the judgment, the consequences, and Grace's earlier warning echoed in her mind, "It's not over." Deep down she sensed the truth of it, the worst was yet to come. The plane touched down smoothly, the familiar jolt signaling the end of the journey for most. Passengers began their routine, unbuckling seatbelts, gathering luggage, but for Vicky, it was the beginning of her reckoning. She stood rigidly near the galley, her hands gripping the counter as if it could keep her upright. Her eyes flicked toward the main cabin, where John remained seated, calm and unhurried, a stark contrast to her unraveling composure. Sarah leaned toward John, her voice barely audible above the rustle of departing passengers. "What's the plan?" she asked, her tone soft but steady. John's expression didn't waver. "We're waiting," he replied simply. "Things are already in motion." As the first-class passengers disembarked, many gave the Anderson family sidelong glances. One middle-aged man paused beside John's seat, hesitating before speaking. "I apologize for what happened earlier," he said, his voice low and earnest. "It wasn't right." John looked up, offering a curt nod. "Thank you," he said, his tone polite but firm. The man nodded in return and shuffled toward the exit, his face etched with thought. Standing near the main door of the plane, Vicky forced a smile for each departing passenger. Every polite nod and murmured goodbye felt like another stone weighing her down. She couldn't stop glancing toward first class, where the Anderson family lingered, their unhurried departure fueling her dread. The galley phone rang and she jumped, snatching it up with a trembling hand. "Vicky speaking," she answered, her voice strained. The captain's tone was stern, authoritative. "Security personnel are waiting at the gate. They've been briefed by the executive team. You are to remain on board and provide a full account of your actions. Do not leave the plane until instructed." Her heart sank. "Understood," she whispered, barely audible. As she hung up, Grace approached, her expression somber. "They're here, aren't they?" Grace asked. Vicky nodded, numb. "Security, the executive team, probably the board." Grace sighed, shaking her head. "I told you this wasn't over." The cabin emptied, leaving an eerie silence. Vicky watched John rise from his seat, smoothing his jacket with a calm, deliberate motion. He helped Sarah gather their belongings while Ethan clutched his toy plane, looking up at his parents with wide, curious eyes. Vicky stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Mr. Anderson, I wanted to apologize again for—" John raised a hand, cutting her off. His tone was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel. "Save it. Those waiting outside will hear anything you have to say." Sarah cast Vicky a cold, piercing glance as she took Ethan's hand and stepped into the aisle. John followed, his presence commanding without effort. As they neared the exit, 2 uniformed security officers boarded the plane, nodding briefly to John before fixing their gaze on Vicky. "Miss Summers?" one of the officers asked, his tone businesslike. "Yes," she managed, her voice a whisper. "We need you to remain on board for questioning," he said. "Please accompany us to the galley." John paused at the doorway, turning to meet Vicky's eyes. His expression remained calm, but the sharpness in his gaze sent a shiver down her spine. Without another word, he stepped off the plane, his family close behind. As they disappeared into the terminal, Vicky felt the weight of her actions crashing down. The officers gestured toward the galley and she followed, her legs unsteady. The realization dawned on her with brutal clarity. Her future was no longer her own to control. Richard's brow furrowed. "There was no issue with their tickets, Miss Summers. Mr. Anderson and his family had legitimate first-class tickets. Do you understand the seriousness of your actions?" Vicky swallowed hard, struggling to maintain her composure. I was just following protocol," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "There was a complaint and I was acting on it." The other officer spoke up, his tone sharper. "A complaint based on what? From whom? And what protocol dictates removing a paying passenger from their assigned seat without cause?" Vicky's mind raced, desperately searching for an explanation that would absolve her of responsibility. But she knew deep down that there was no excuse for her actions. She had allowed her own prejudices and assumptions to cloud her judgment, and now she was facing the consequences. I don't know," she mumbled, tears welling up in her eyes. "I made a mistake." Back in the terminal, John and Sarah stood by the baggage carousel, waiting for their luggage. Ethan was getting restless, tugging on Sarah's hand and pointing at the colorful displays in the nearby shops. John knelt down, his voice gentle as he spoke to his son. "Just a little longer, buddy," he said. Then we can go get some ice cream. Sarah watched them, a faint smile playing on her lips. Despite the ordeal they had just endured, she felt a surge of gratitude for the strength and resilience of her family. She knew that John would fight for justice, not just for themselves but for anyone who had been subjected to similar discrimination. As their bags finally appeared on the carousel, John stood up, his gaze fixed on the exit. He knew that the battle was far from over, but he was prepared to face it head-on. He would use his position and influence to ensure that Sky-High Airlines, and indeed the entire industry, took meaningful steps to combat prejudice and promote equality. "Let's go home," he said, his voice firm. Inside the plane, Vicky sat in stunned silence as the security officers continued their questioning. With each question, she sank deeper into despair, realizing the gravity of her situation. Her career, her reputation, her future, all seemed to hang in the balance. As the weight of her actions pressed down on her, a sense of remorse began to stir within her. She had allowed her own biases to dictate her behavior, and in doing so she had caused immense pain and humiliation to an innocent family. Perhaps, she thought, this was an opportunity for her to learn and grow, to confront her own prejudices and become a better person. The interrogation continued, but Vicky no longer offered resistance. She answered the questions honestly and forthrightly, taking full responsibility for her actions. When the officers finally finished, they stood up, their faces impassive. "You will be contacted by the airline's legal team," one of them said. "In the meantime, you are suspended from your duties, effective immediately." Vicky nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. She knew that she had lost everything, but perhaps, just perhaps, she could still find a way to redeem herself. The officer frowned. "The issue isn't their tickets, it's your actions. Why did you remove a family with confirmed first-class reservations?" Veronica's words caught in her throat. "I was following protocol," she stammered. "I thought there might have been some mistake. First class is a premium area and they just..." She stopped, feeling her cheeks flush with the realization of her implication. The officer's face hardened. "They didn't fit the profile, is that it?" "No, that's not what I meant," Veronica defended, her voice shaking. "I made a mistake. I didn't mean to offend." The second officer leaned in, his gaze sharp as a razor. "Intentions don't matter. Actions do, and your actions have consequences. Do you understand the gravity of this situation?" Veronica nodded, her throat dry. Each word felt like a noose tightening around her career. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," she whispered. "I was just doing my job." The first officer's eyes remained unwavering. "Your job is to treat passengers with respect and courtesy. Today you did the opposite." Silence descended, heavy and accusatory. For the first time, Veronica fully grasped the damage she had caused, not just to her own future but to the Anderson family. John's steely composure and Sarah's quiet strength haunted her. She had misjudged them and now she was paying the price. At the terminal, the Anderson family reached the baggage claim area. Liam watched the carousel with glee, clutching a toy airplane in his hand, while John and Sarah stood quietly, their calm exteriors concealing the turmoil within. "Do you think they'll actually do something about it?" Sarah asked, her voice low. John looked at her, his eyes darkening. "They won't have a choice. Their reputation is on the line. If they don't address this, it'll blow up into something bigger." His phone buzzed and he glanced at it, a message from his legal team confirming that the incident had reached the airline's board. A faint smile touched his lips as he slipped the device back into his pocket. "They'll act," he stated with quiet certainty. "And if they don't, I guarantee they'll regret it." The family collected their luggage and headed for the exit, their steps purposeful. Behind them, whispers rippled through the crowd, sympathy, outrage, disbelief. The events of this flight would not fade quietly. For John, this day was far from over. Meetings loomed, decisions awaited, and changes needed to be enforced. As he stepped into the waiting car, he glanced back at the airport. The storm he had unleashed was just beginning. The public reaction exploded like a wildfire, fierce and unstoppable. On social media, support for John Anderson surged as users voiced outrage, sharing personal stories of airline bias and mistreatment. Posts directly tagging the airline, demanding answers and accountability with hashtags like #AirlineAccountability, went viral across platforms. John's phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages, but he brushed most aside, focusing on the crucial meeting with the airline CEO scheduled for the next day. In their cozy living room, Sarah watched a news segment flash across the TV screen. A panel analyzed the incident with fervor. "This isn't just about one family losing their seats," one commentator stressed, her sharp voice full of conviction. It's about systemic bias that's deeply embedded within the customer service industry. The indignity this family suffered despite holding valid tickets exposes a rot far deeper than one bad call. Sarah muted the TV, her face etched with thought. She glanced at Ethan, their son, who was stacking wooden blocks into a wobbly tower, blissfully unaware of the turmoil engulfing them. His innocence tugged at her heart. She envied it, but it also fueled her resolve to protect it. This ordeal had shaken her to her core, but it also illuminated why they couldn't let this go. At the airline's sleek headquarters, the executive suite was a war room in full-blown crisis mode. CEO Robert Lang stood at the head of the conference table, his stern face etched with tension. Around him, senior leaders pored over reports, news clippings and social media dashboards, tracking the situation spiraling out of their control. "This is a disaster," one executive muttered, flipping through a thick stack of papers. "We've weathered PR storms before, but this time it's different. It involves a major stakeholder. We screw this up, we lose him, plus our reputation." Robert raised his hand, silencing the room with a sharp gesture. "Where are we with the internal review?" he demanded, his tone curt. A senior HR director cleared his throat nervously. "We've interviewed the flight attendant involved. Her actions stemmed from apparent bias, though she claims it wasn't intentional. She's been suspended pending further investigation." Robert clenched his jaw, his frown deepening. "Suspended? That's not enough. We're dealing with a shareholder who can go straight to the board. We need bold moves, not half measures." Another executive spoke cautiously, "We're drafting a public apology and implementing new training initiatives. We've reached out to Mr. Anderson's team to arrange a meeting." Robert nodded, but the tension still gripped him. Good, but words won't appease him. He's not just angry, he's strategic. He'll demand systematic overhauls, and we better be ready to deliver. Silence fell over the room, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just about damage control, it was about confronting a flawed culture that allowed this to happen. Back in her apartment, Vicky slumped onto the couch, staring at the cold termination notice glaring on her laptop. The email from HR was blunt. "Your actions on Flight 237 violated our core values and customer service policies. Your employment is terminated with immediate effect." Her hands trembled as she read it again, the words blurring with tears. In a single day her career, one she had taken years to build with pride, had crumbled, and it was her fault. Her phone buzzed with messages from friends and family who had heard the news. Some offered sympathy, others made no secret of their criticism. She ignored them all, the shame too overwhelming to respond. Seeking escape, she switched on the TV, only to be confronted by a news anchor's incisive analysis. "The airline's response has sparked outrage, especially given the racial undertones of the flight attendants' actions. It's a wake-up call. Unconscious bias has real, devastating consequences." Vicky switched off the screen, burying her face in her hands. She had convinced herself that her decision had been a routine, harmless choice. Now the truth had crashed down. Her bias had warped her judgment, hurting the Anderson family and incinerating the company she had once cherished. For the first time she felt the full weight of her actions. Not just the loss of her job but the pain she had inflicted. Hesitantly, she opened her laptop and began typing an email to the Anderson family. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Anderson," she wrote, "I am writing to sincerely apologize for my actions on Flight 237. I see now how my bias shaped my decision, and I am deeply sorry for the pain and humiliation I caused your family. My behavior was inexcusable and I take full responsibility." She paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. Forgiveness wasn't her goal, just accountability. She pressed send and slumped back, staring at the screen. It was a small gesture, but it was something. As night fell, John sat in his study, poring over the airline's draft reform plan. It was detailed: mandatory training, new accountability measures, a commitment to inclusivity, but he knew that empty promises wouldn't heal the wounds. Sarah entered, carrying a steaming mug of tea. "Is this what you wanted?" she asked, nodding towards the papers. John looked up, his gaze unwavering. "It's a start," he said, "but it's not enough." He took the tea, his expression softening for a moment. "This isn't about punishing one person, it's about making sure no one else has to endure what we did." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, nodding. "Then make them accountable." John's faint smile carried unwavering resolve. The battle was far from over and he wouldn't back down. The next morning, John strode into the airline's towering headquarters for his meeting with Robert Langston. The modern building loomed over the city, its glass facade gleaming. A composed assistant met him in the lobby, her voice polite but strained. "Mr. Anderson, Mr. Langston is waiting. This way, please." John followed her through polished corridors, his steps measured, drawing quick glances from employees aware of his purpose. In the executive conference room, Robert rose to greet him, offering a firm handshake. "Mr. Anderson, thank you for coming. We are deeply sorry for the circumstances that have brought us here." John's grip was solid, his tone resolute. "Let's cut to the chase. Regret means nothing without action." Robert nodded, his face drawn with tension, and gestured towards a screen displaying a detailed plan. "We've acted swiftly," he began. "The flight attendant has been terminated. We've implemented mandatory bias training for all employees, starting with frontline positions, and we're tightening accountability measures to prevent a recurrence." John listened, his eyes scanning the slides, but he remained unconvinced. As Robert finished, John leaned forward. "It's a decent start, but don't act like firing one person and some training fixes this. Your culture is broken, policy tweaks won't cut it. I want monthly progress reports, data, feedback, trends, measurable results. And an independent third-party audit, not some internal review." Robert hesitated, then conceded. "We'll do it. Anything else?" John's gaze sharpened. "Yes, a public apology not just to us, but to every passenger you've discriminated against. This sets a standard." Robert swallowed but nodded. "We'll release it today." John leaned back, calm yet authoritative. "I'll be watching, Langston. Don't mistake my patience for tolerance." The room hummed with unspoken pressure as Robert assured, "We won't let you down." Leaving the headquarters, John's phone lit up with alerts. Social media was ablaze with #BiasInFlight trending worldwide, voices amplifying support and demanding broader change. This had grown beyond his family, it had become a movement. At home, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, reading the airline's public relations email outlining their apology and commitments. She forwarded it to John with a note, "Your thoughts?" He replied as he walked in, "Enough." She scoffed. "High praise from you." He chuckled, leaning against the counter. "It's a start, but the road is long." She nodded thoughtfully. "They going to follow through, or is this just PR?" He narrowed his eyes. "If they don't, they'll regret it." At the airline, whispers of change echoed through the break rooms. Some employees welcomed the focus on fairness. Others doubted a large corporation could shift so quickly. Vicky's dismissal had fueled hushed debates, shock at the speed, but agreement that she'd crossed a line. Grace, a former colleague of hers, pondered as she prepared for her shift. The incident had exposed cracks she'd long overlooked, and she vowed to treat passengers differently in the future. That night, as John and Sarah prepared for bed, Ethan peeked in, clutching a toy airplane. "Mom, Dad, are people still mad about the airplane?" John knelt down, gently hugging him. "Some people are, buddy, but it's because they want things to be better. We're helping make it better." Ethan nodded. "You're gonna fix it?" John ruffled his hair. "That's the plan." After Ethan left, Sarah caught John's eye, pride and purpose shining in hers. "We're going to fix it, for us and for everyone." John nodded, resolute. "This isn't the end. Here's a detailed recap of the events from the 1 hour and 38 seconds to 1 hour 7 minutes and 59 seconds mark, reimagined within a modern American setting with Americanized names and an engaging, emotional narrative style. The core meaning of the original story remains intact, but the language is more vivid, the emotions heightened, and the context feels relatable to today's audience. The morning dawned with a storm of headlines as Sky-High Airlines dropped a bombshell apology overnight. The apology was stark and unadorned, acknowledging the debacle involving John Anderson and his family on Flight 237. "We are deeply sorry for what happened," the statement declared, heavy with remorse. "This is not who we are. We are taking real steps to fix this, mandatory training, tougher policies, and external audits to keep us honest." They didn't stop there, they included a personal thank you to John, not just as a shareholder but as a customer they'd failed. Across the nation, phones lit up with reactions. Twitter exploded with #AccountabilityMatters and #FlyFair, some applauding Sky-High's bold move, others shaking their heads at what seemed like damage control. The air buzzed with debate. Had the airline truly changed, or was this just corporate theatrics? At the kitchen table, John scanned the report, his face a map of quiet determination. Sarah sat across from him, steam curling from her coffee mug, her eyes locked on his. "Well?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent. John placed his phone down with a soft thud. "It's a start," he said, weighing his words. But they have to back it up with action. Sarah nodded, her lips pressed into a tight line. What about Vicky? Think she got the message? John's gaze drifted away, wrestling with the thought. Not my place to say, he replied after a pause. But I hope so. She was part of the problem, might as well be part of the fix if she steps up. The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of hope and doubt. Meanwhile, in her dimly lit, small apartment, Vicky Summers hunched over her laptop, the harsh glow of news articles stinging her eyes. Sky High's apology didn't soothe her, it deepened the sting of guilt. Every headline screamed her shame, every comment felt like a personal stab. She opened the email she'd sent the Andersons last night, a feeble plea for forgiveness she didn't expect them to accept. No reply. She didn't deserve forgiveness and she knew it. But hitting send had been like taking a breath again, a tiny, desperate step towards acknowledging her wrong. Her phone vibrated, jolting her back. A text from Grace. Heard you got fired. You okay? Maybe this is a fresh start. Vicky stared at it, her chest tightening, then typed back. Thanks, Grace. Trying to be. Got a lot to figure out. Grace replied quickly. Here if you need me. We all make mistakes, it's what you do after that matters. Vicky set down her phone, Grace's words echoing like a lifeline. She couldn't undo the past, but maybe she could rewrite her future. At Sky High's gleaming headquarters, Robert Lang faced the board of directors, presenting their reform plan like a man on trial. John Anderson stood at the end of the table, his silence louder than any argument. The room crackled with tension as Robert outlined the corrective measures. New training, audits, the works. He turned to John, hopeful. Mr. Anderson, we believe this encompasses what you laid out. Your push has been instrumental. John leaned forward, his gaze sharp. It's a decent start, he said, his voice like steel, but that's all it is. I'll be watching to make sure it's not just lip service. The board shifted uneasily, but no one pushed back. John's influence was undeniable. As the meeting adjourned, a silver-haired board member approached, her face kind but resolute. Mr. Anderson, some of us are behind you on this. This is exactly the reckoning we needed. John gave a small, measured smile. Thank you. Now let's make it real. That evening, John stepped into the backyard, where Sarah watched their son Ethan whirl around with a toy airplane, his laughter cutting through the twilight. John wrapped his arms around her, drawing them both close. The meeting went well, he said simply and firmly. Sarah grinned. Gave them hell, didn't you? He chuckled. Close enough. They stood there, basking in Ethan's joy until Sarah's voice softened. You think we'll ever stop fighting these fights? John sighed, his eyes following the horizon. Probably not. But each one gets us closer to something better. We just keep pushing, it'll happen. Sarah leaned into him. If anyone can make it happen, it's you. John's smile was warm, certain. It's us. Together. Ethan's infectious laughter enveloped them, a fleeting moment of solace before the long road ahead. The shockwaves from Flight 237 hadn't subsided. They were growing. Media outlets hailed Sky High's reforms as a turning point, a spark igniting the aviation world. Other airlines followed suit, announcing their own changes, spurred by public heat and John's unrelenting stance. The Anderson story became a beacon, fueling advocacy groups demanding fairness across industries. Social media buzzed with passengers sharing their own stories of bias, voices amplified in Sky High's spotlight. At home, John and Sarah watched the developments unfold, hopeful but wary. This wasn't about reputation, it was about results. Their fight was for the next family, not retribution. One afternoon, an email from Robert Lang pinged into John's inbox. Progress report. Inside, the numbers spoke volumes. 80% of staff trained, audits underway, initial findings charting a path forward. Lang's note sealed it. We're in this, Mr. Anderson. You've put us back on course. It all started with an email. John Anderson sat at his kitchen table, the light from his laptop illuminating his tired but resolute face. The message was from Robert Lang, CEO of Sky High Airlines. Thank you for holding us accountable. Your persistence in doing what's right has made our company better, and we're not stopping there. John read it twice, letting the words sink in. This wasn't just an apology, it was a promise. He forwarded it to his wife, Sarah, adding a quick note, Step 1 complete. On to Step 2. His tone was calm, but his determination blazed. They had faced indignity on that flight, and now the airline was listening. It felt like a crack in a wall that had stood for too long. Across town, Vicky Summers sat in a dimly lit coffee shop, her laptop open to a sea of job listings. The week since she'd been fired had been a storm of regret and sleepless nights. She was the flight attendant that day, the one who let unconscious bias turn a routine flight into a nightmare for the Anderson family. The memory was searing, raw, and relentless. But she refused to let it define her. She had signed up for unconscious bias and diversity workshops, determined to dig into where she'd gone wrong. As she sipped her coffee, her phone buzzed, an email from the Anderson family. She held her breath as she opened it. "Miss Summers, thank you for your apology. While we cannot undo what happened, we appreciate your acknowledgement of the harm caused. Growth starts with accountability, and we hope you continue to pursue it." Vicky's eyes blurred with tears. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a lifeline. She closed her laptop, her jaw set. The past was etched in stone, but the future? That was hers to shape. A month later, John boarded another sky-high flight, this time with Sarah and their son Ethan by his side. He noticed the difference immediately. The staff moved with quiet confidence, their smiles genuine, their greetings warm. No sideways glances, no hesitation, just professionalism. As they settled into their seats in first class, Sarah nudged him gently, her voice soft. "You think they know who you are?" she asked, a teasing smile playing on her lips. John grinned, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter if they do. What matters is they're treating everyone right." The plane taxied towards the runway and Ethan bounced in his seat, clutching his toy airplane. "We're flying again, Dad?" he chirped, his eyes wide with excitement. John ruffled his hair, his chest swelling with pride. "That's right, buddy, we are." He caught Sarah's eye, steady, bright, unwavering. This was why they fought. For Ethan's joy, for their dignity, for a world that didn't shrink them into stereotypes. The plane soared into the sky, the clouds parting like a soft white sea outside the window. John leaned back, letting the hum of the engines seep into his bones. The fight wasn't over, there was always more to do, more walls to break down. But for now he breathed. Their story rippled outward, igniting headlines and hashtags, pushing Sky High to overhaul its training and policies. Other airlines were watching, shifting, caught in the crosswinds of public outrage and the Andersons' quiet courage. It wasn't just their victory, it was a spark. On the ground, Vicky sat in a workshop, pen scratching across her notebook. The instructor's voice faded into the background as she recorded the questions she was finally brave enough to ask herself. She was changing, one painful step at a time, and it felt like purpose. Back in the sky, John gazed at the stretching horizon. Sometimes he thought starting the journey was enough. Thank you for joining us on this journey, a story of accountability, resilience, and the power of standing up. If it moved you, hit the like button, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more stories that matter. See you next time. This rewritten story combines emotional depth with a clear narrative arc, highlighting the Anderson family's dignity, Vicky's redemption, and the broader impact of their conflict. It stands as a self-contained tale, prompting reflection on bias, growth, and the quiet power of doing what's right.